October 15th, 1955. The date is burned into my memory like a brand marking the moment my world split into before and after. I was 25 years old, 5 months pregnant, stirring beef stew in the kitchen of our little house on Elm Street, while my husband Alex hummed off key behind me, his hands resting on my rounded belly. "Feel that?" I laughed, placing my hand over his as our baby kicked. "Someone's getting restless in there. Probably excited about dinner." Alex grinned, kissing my neck. "Or maybe he's tired of us arguing about names. What do you think, little one? Are you an Elijah or a Samuel?" "What if she's a girl?" I countered the same playful argument we'd been having for weeks. "I still think Diana sounds strong and adventurous." The rain was coming down hard outside, drumming against our windows in a rhythm that should have been comforting. Our house felt like a perfect cocoon that evening. Warm lamplight, the smell of dinner, cooking, the gentle weight of pregnancy, making me feel wonderfully, completely alive. Alex had just gotten his first big client at the accounting firm, and we'd been talking about maybe taking a trip to California after the baby was born. Then the front door exploded inward. My father stood there like something out of a nightmare, rain streaming from his gray hair, his clothes soaked through. But it was his eyes that made my blood freeze. Wild, burning, with something I'd never seen before, something that looked like madness mixed with rage. "You've taken her from me!" he roared at Alex, his voice cutting through the storm's noise. "You've poisoned her mind, turned her against her own flesh and blood." Before I could process what was happening, before I could even scream, there was a knife in his hand. The long hunting blade he used for gutting deer. Alex stepped in front of me, his hands raised peacefully. "Sir, please, let's talk about this calmly. We're family now." The blade plunged into Alex's chest with a wet, horrible sound that will haunt me until I die. Once, twice, 3 times each thrust, accompanied by my father's grunts of effort and rage. My husband, my sweet, gentle Alex, who'd never hurt anyone in his life, crumpled to our yellow linoleum floor, his blood spreading in a pool that reflected our kitchen lights. I fell to my knees beside him, pressing my hands against the wounds, trying desperately to hold his life inside his body. "Stay with me, Alex. Please stay with me. The baby needs you. I need you." My father grabbed my hair and yanked my head back so hard I saw stars. His breath reeked of whiskey and something sour. "You're mine again," he whispered against my ear, his voice thick with satisfaction. "You've always been mine, Catherine. Always." What happened next? Even now, 40 years later, I struggle to find words that convey the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about family, about safety, about love. My father, the man who'd taught me to tie my shoes, who'd carried me on his shoulders at county fairs, who'd walked me down the aisle just 2 years before, violated me right there on my kitchen floor, while my husband's blood pooled around us and our unborn child moved in my belly. The transformation from father to monster was instantaneous, yet it felt like watching my entire childhood crumble in slow motion, every memory recontextualized by this horrific revelation of what he truly was. To understand what happened that night, I need to take you back to the beginning, to the childhood that should have warned me what my father was capable of. William Harrison was 42 when I was born, already set in his ways, and convinced that the world was a dangerous place that threatened everything he held dear. My mother, Mary, was 19 years younger and had the kind of gentle spirit that wilted under his increasingly possessive attention. She died when I was 12, officially from pneumonia, though I've always wondered if there was more to it. "Your mother was too trusting," he told me at her funeral, his hand gripping my shoulder hard enough to bruise. "She let people take advantage of her soft heart. You won't make that mistake, Catherine. I'll make sure of it." And he did. Throughout my teenage years, he monitored every friendship, interrogated every boy who looked my way, and made it clear that no one would ever be good enough for his daughter. When I brought friends home from school, he'd find reasons to humiliate them until they stopped coming around. When Tommy Peterson asked me to the spring dance, my father showed up at the boys' house with his shotgun to have a conversation about appropriate behavior. "I'm just protecting you," he'd say whenever I protested. "A father's job is to keep his daughter safe, and that means keeping her close. The world is full of people who want to hurt you, Catherine, but you'll always be safe with me." The strange thing was I believed him. When you're raised in isolation, when one person controls all the information you receive about the world, you don't question their version of reality. I thought his behavior was normal, protective parenting, not the gradual conditioning of a possessive predator. The turning point came when I was 18 and received a scholarship to the State Teachers College in Harrisburg. For the first time in my life, I'd have the chance to leave Millbrook to see what existed beyond my father's suffocating control. "You don't need college," he argued, pacing our living room like a caged animal. "I can teach you everything you need to know about running a household, about being a good wife and mother. These professors, they'll fill your head with ideas that go against nature, against family." But I was desperate for something more than the narrow life he'd mapped out for me. I applied without telling him, used my high school guidance counselor as a reference, and when the acceptance letter came, I presented it as a fait accompli. The rage that crossed his face that day was the first glimpse I'd gotten of the monster hiding beneath his facade of paternal concern. For just a moment, his mask slipped completely, and I saw something that made my skin crawl. A naked possessiveness that had nothing to do with fatherly love. "You think you can just leave me?" he whispered, his voice deadly quiet. "After everything I've done for you, everything I've sacrificed. You belong here, Catherine. You belong to me." But I was 18 and legally free to make my own choices. I packed my bags, took the bus to Harrisburg, and for the first time in my life, I breathed freely. College was a revelation. Suddenly, I was surrounded by people my own age who talked about books and ideas and dreams that stretched far beyond the boundaries of small-town Pennsylvania. I threw myself into my studies, majoring in education with plans to teach elementary school, and for the first time felt like I was becoming the person I was meant to be. That's where I met Alex Collins, a junior studying accounting who had the kind of easy laugh and gentle manner that drew people like magnets. He was everything my father wasn't: patient, encouraging, genuinely interested in what I had to say. He never tried to control or possess me. Instead, he seemed to delight in watching me discover my own strength and independence. "You light up when you talk about teaching," he said one afternoon as we studied together in the library. "I love watching you plan lessons, seeing how excited you get about reaching those kids. You're going to be an amazing teacher, Catherine." It was the first time in my life that someone had encouraged my ambitions rather than trying to diminish them. I fell in love not just with Alex, but with the version of myself I became when I was with him. Confident, capable, worthy of respect and partnership. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and those were the happiest years of my life. He introduced me to his family, warm, loving people who welcomed me with open arms. His mother taught me to cook his favorite dishes, his father shared stories about Alex's childhood, and his younger sister became the close female friend I'd never been allowed to have. But throughout this time, my father's letters and phone calls grew increasingly desperate and manipulative. "You're breaking my heart, Catherine," he'd write. "Your mother would be devastated to see how you've turned your back on family. I'm getting older, and I need you here. The hardware store isn't doing well without you to help with the books. Come home where you belong." When I brought Alex home to meet him during Christmas break of my senior year, the tension was immediately palpable. My father was polite on the surface, but I could see the hatred simmering beneath his smile. "So you're the boy who's been filling my daughter's head with nonsense," he said over dinner, his tone light, but his eyes cold as winter. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir," Alex replied carefully. Catherine's incredibly intelligent and capable. She doesn't need anyone to put ideas in her head. She's always been a dreamer. My father continued as if I wasn't sitting right there. Needs someone to keep her grounded, help her understand what's practical? A woman's place is with her family, not chasing fantasies. I watched Alex's jaw tighten, saw him struggle to remain respectful in the face of such obvious condescension. With respect, Mr. Harrison, I think Catherine should be free to pursue whatever makes her happy. I want to support her dreams, not limit them. The look my father gave Alex in that moment should have been a warning. Pure, undiluted hatred, mixed with something that looked almost like jealousy. But I was too young and too happy to recognize the danger. Alex and I graduated in the spring of 1953 and married that summer in a small ceremony at his family's church. My father walked me down the aisle with tears streaming down his face, and I thought they were tears of pride and love. Only later would I understand they were tears of rage and loss, the grief of a possessive man watching his property slip away. The first 2 years of our marriage were pure joy. We bought the little house on Elm Street with money Alex had saved from his part-time job and a small inheritance from his grandmother. I got a job teaching second grade at Millbrook Elementary, and Alex found work at a small accounting firm in town. We were young and in love and full of plans for the future. Alex wanted to eventually start his own practice, maybe move to a bigger city where there would be more opportunities. I dreamed of having children, of creating the warm, nurturing family I'd never really had. My father, meanwhile, seemed to be adjusting to our marriage better than I'd expected. He visited regularly, always bringing gifts or offering to help with household repairs. On the surface, he appeared to be the doting father-in-law proud of the life his daughter had built. But there were signs, if I'd been wise enough to read them. The way he'd let himself into our house without knocking, claiming he was just checking to make sure we were safe. The comments about Alex's job prospects delivered with concern, but tinged with undermining doubt. The way his eyes would linger on me when he thought no one was looking, as if he was cataloging changes in my appearance or behavior. Your father makes me uncomfortable, Alex admitted one night after a particularly tense dinner. There's something about the way he looks at you. It's not normal, Catherine. It's like he sees you as his possession rather than his daughter. I brushed off his concerns the way children of abusive parents often do. He's just having trouble letting go, I said. He raised me alone after Mom died. It's hard for him to accept that I'm grown up now. But deep down, I knew Alex was right. There was something unhealthy about my father's attention, something that made my skin crawl, even as I told myself I was being silly. When I discovered I was pregnant in the spring of 1955, Alex was over the moon. He immediately started planning improvements to the house, talking about converting the spare room into a nursery, saving money for the baby's future education. My father's reaction was more complicated. On the surface, he seemed pleased about becoming a grandfather, but there was an undercurrent of something darker in his enthusiasm. A baby will change everything, he said during one of his visits, his hand resting possessively on my still flat stomach. You'll need help, Catherine. More help than that boy can provide. You'll need your father. As the pregnancy progressed and my body began to change, I noticed my father's visits becoming more frequent and his behavior more intrusive. He'd find excuses to touch my growing belly, commenting on my appearance in ways that made me deeply uncomfortable. You're glowing, he'd say, his eyes moving over my body in a way that felt wrong. Pregnancy suits you, daughter. You look just like your mother did when she was carrying you. The comparison always made me shudder, though I couldn't quite articulate why. There was something in his tone and the way he looked at me that felt more like a lover's appreciation than a father's pride. By my 5th month, I was beginning to feel trapped again the way I had as a teenager. My father's presence in our home became suffocating, his comments more possessive, his behavior more erratic. Maybe we should move, I suggested to Alex one evening after my father had left. Get a fresh start somewhere else away from all this. intensity. Alex was immediately supportive. "If that's what you want, we'll do it. My cousin in California says there are opportunities out there for accountants, and you could probably find teaching work too. We could leave after the baby's born, start over somewhere new." It was a beautiful dream, and we spent many evenings that fall planning our escape. We researched cities, looked at job prospects, imagined the life we'd build far from my father's influence. We never got the chance to make that move. October 15th came first, and with it the end of everything we'd built together. After my father killed Alex and violated me in our kitchen, the world took on a surreal, nightmarish quality that I still struggle to describe. He cleaned up methodically, wrapping Alex's body in our wedding quilt and loading it into his truck, while I sat motionless on the blood-stained floor, too shocked to move or speak. "Tell anyone about this and you'll join him," he said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "I've buried bodies before Catherine, during the war. One more won't make any difference." The threat paralyzed me completely. This was 1955, in a small town where my father was a respected businessman and pillar of the community. Who would believe that William Harrison, who donated generously to the church and organized the annual 4th of July picnic, had murdered his son-in-law in cold blood? He moved quickly to control the narrative. The next morning, he spread word around town that Alex had run off during the night, abandoning his pregnant wife for parts unknown. The story spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Whispers of pity for poor Catherine Harrison, left high and dry by her no-account husband. Always knew that boy was no good. I heard Mrs. Henderson tell Mrs. Cooper at the grocery store, "City boy like that probably had another woman on the side." Poor Catherine, pregnant and alone. My father played the role of the heartbroken, supportive father perfectly. He moved me out of the house on Elm Street, telling neighbors he was taking care of his delicate daughter in her time of need. The sympathy and support he received from the community only reinforced his confidence that he could get away with anything. The cabin where he took me sat on 20 acres of isolated woodland that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. As a child, I'd sometimes accompanied him on hunting trips there, never imagining it would one day become my prison. He'd prepared it carefully for my captivity. The windows were boarded up except for narrow slits that let in just enough light to see by. The phone line had been cut. Locks were installed on the outside of every door. He'd even stocked the pantry with canned goods and supplies as if he'd been planning this for months. "This is how it should have been from the beginning?" he told me on that first horrible night, forcing himself on me while I was still in shock from Alex's murder. "You never should have left me, Catherine. You belong here with me where I can keep you safe." The assaults became a nightmarish routine. He'd appear at all hours, day or night, taking what he claimed was rightfully his, while whispering twisted justifications in my ear. He spoke about my mother during these attacks, comparing my body to hers, describing things that made my skin crawl with revulsion. "Your mother fought me at first, too." He'd grunt his weight, crushing my growing belly. "But she learned to accept her place, learned to appreciate what I could give her. You'll learn too, Catherine. You'll see that this is love, the truest kind of love there is." It was during one of these conversations that I finally understood what had really happened to my mother. The pneumonia story was a lie. He'd killed her too, probably when she'd tried to leave him or protect me from his attention. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow, adding another layer of horror to my captivity. The weeks blended together in a haze of fear, pain, and despair. My body began to rebel against the constant trauma, cramping, bleeding nausea that went far beyond normal morning sickness. The baby's movements became weaker, less frequent, as if our child could sense the danger we were both in. I tried to keep track of time by scratching marks on the wall beside my bed, but my father noticed and flew into a rage, beating me until I promised to stop. After that, the days lost all meaning, becoming an endless cycle of assault terror and the crushing weight of hopelessness. He brought me newspapers sometimes, showing me articles about the search for Alex. The police had questioned him, of course, but his story was solid. Alex had been depressed, about money troubles, had talked about leaving town, had probably just run off to start over somewhere else. Without a body or any evidence of foul play, there was little they could do. "See how easy it is," he'd taunt, spreading the newspaper articles on my bed. "Everyone believes what I tell them because I'm a respected member of this community. You're nothing, Catherine. You're just a hysterical pregnant woman whose husband abandoned her. No one will ever believe your word against mine." I began to wonder if he was right. The isolation was eating away at my sanity, making me question my own memories and perceptions. Had Alex really loved me, or had my father been right about his character? Was I somehow responsible for what had happened? The self-doubt was almost as destructive as the physical abuse. I started keeping a journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin's main room. Writing became my lifeline, the one way I could hold on to the truth when everything else felt like it was slipping away. October 28th, 1955. I wrote in shaky handwriting. He killed Alex 13 days ago. I can still see Alex's face when the knife went in, the surprise and pain in his eyes. He was trying to protect me, trying to be the man I married. I have to remember that. I have to remember who Alex really was, no matter what lies he tells me. The journal entries became longer and more detailed as the weeks passed. I wrote about Alex's dreams, our plans for the future, the way he used to sing off-key lullabies to my belly. I wrote letters to our unborn child, trying to explain about the father they'd never meet. "Your daddy was a good man, little one," I wrote one night by candlelight. "He had gentle hands and a laugh that could fill up a room. He wanted to teach you to play baseball and take you fishing at the creek behind his parents' house. He loved you so much, already used to talk to you every night before bed. Hold on just a little longer. Mama's going to find a way to get us out of here." But as the weeks turned into months, that hope began to fade. My body was deteriorating under the constant stress and trauma. The baby's movements became so weak, I sometimes went days without feeling anything terror growing, that I was already too late to save the life growing inside me. The escape attempt came on a bitter January night, nearly 3 months into my captivity. My father had been drinking heavily and was more violent than usual during his assault. As he lay passed out beside me afterward, I felt something shift inside my body. A terrible cramping that told me our time was running out. I grabbed the heavy brass bookend from the nightstand and brought it down on his skull with every ounce of strength I had left. The impact made a sickening sound, and blood immediately began pooling on his pillow. For a terrifying moment, I thought I'd killed him, but then he groaned and rolled over, dazed but alive. It was enough. I slipped out of the bed and ran for the door, my bare feet sliding on the icy floor. The locks took precious seconds to open my hands, shaking so badly I could barely work the mechanisms. Behind me, I could hear him stirring, cursing, trying to get his bearings. I ran into the storm wearing nothing but a torn nightgown, and my father's oversized hunting boots, the snow cutting into my exposed skin like knives. The woods were a maze of shadows and ice, every step a gamble, but terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the underbrush, shouting my name with a rage that echoed through the trees. "Catherine, you get back here right now. You can't survive out there. You need me." I made it nearly 2 miles before the pain doubled me over completely. Contractions ripped through my body as I collapsed against a fallen oak tree, the snow around me quickly turning red with blood. I knew with absolute certainty that our baby was dying inside me, that the months of trauma had finally taken their inevitable toll. I gave birth alone in that frozen wilderness, my son slipping into the world, silent And still, he was perfect and tiny and beautiful, with Alex's nose and what I imagined were my mother's delicate hands. I held him against my chest and sang the lullabies his father would never get to sing my tears, freezing on my cheeks as the storm raged around us. "I'm so sorry, little one," I whispered into the darkness. "I tried to protect you, tried to keep you safe. Your daddy would have loved you so much. He would have been such a good father." That's where the search party found me 12 hours later. A park ranger and his team following my father's frantic calls about his missing mentally ill daughter. I was hypothermic hemorrhaging and nearly dead from exposure, but I was alive. And for the first time in months, I was free. The official story, according to my father, was that I'd suffered a complete mental breakdown after my husband's abandonment and had become delusional, living rough in the woods, and tragically losing my baby as a result of my own instability. It was a story that painted him as the concerned, heartbroken father trying desperately to help his troubled daughter, and it might have stuck if not for one person who saw through his lies. St. Mary's Hospital in Harrisburg became my sanctuary after that nightmare in the woods. Dr. Patricia Romano, the emergency physician who treated me, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd seen enough trauma cases to recognize the signs of prolonged abuse. "The injuries aren't consistent with exposure," she told the police who came to take my statement. "The pattern of bruising, the evidence of sexual trauma, the malnutrition, this woman has been held captive and systematically abused for months." But it was Maria Santos, the night shift nurse, who truly saved me. Maria was a small woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and hands that were gentle when she changed my bandages or helped me with basic needs. I was too weak to manage alone. She worked the overnight shift when the hospital was quiet, and she had a way of moving through the halls like a guardian angel checking on patients who couldn't sleep. On my 5th night in the hospital, instead of leaving after her usual rounds, she pulled a chair up beside my bed and sat down. "I've seen marks like yours before," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "On my own body 20 years ago." I looked at her more carefully, then noticing the way she kept her sleeves long despite the hospital's warmth, the careful way she moved as if her body still remembered old pain. "My husband used to hit me." She continued staring at her hands folded in her lap. "Started with slaps when I burned dinner or forgot to iron his shirts the way he liked. Escalated to fists, then worse. I told myself it was normal, that all marriages had rough patches, that I must be doing something wrong to make him so angry." Her voice was steady, but I could see tears gathering in her eyes. "It took me 15 years to leave. 15 years of telling myself it would get better, that he loved me, despite the violence that I deserved what he did to me. You know what finally made me run?" I shook my head, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. He started looking at our daughter the same way he looked at me. She was only 12, just starting to develop, and I saw him watching her with that same possessive hunger. That night, I packed 2 suitcases and we left while he was at work. Never looked back. She reached over and took my hand, her touch warm and steady. "I know what those bruises mean, Catherine. I know what that look in your eyes means. And I know that babies don't die from exposure when their mothers are trying to protect them. Tell me what really happened. Tell me everything. I believe you." The kindness in her voice, the absolute certainty that she would listen without judgment, broke something open inside me that had been frozen shut since that terrible night in October. For the first time since Alex's death, I began to cry. Not the silent tears of despair I'd shed in the cabin, but great heaving sobs that shook my entire body. "He killed my husband," I managed to get out between sobs. "My father killed Alex, and then he kept me locked up, and oh God, Maria, he raped me over and over until our baby died, And I couldn't stop him. I couldn't protect any of us. Maria held my hand while I poured out the entire story, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped me remember details I'd thought were lost to trauma. She listened without shock or disbelief, nodding as if everything I told her made perfect, horrible sense. When I finished, she squeezed my hand and made me a promise that would change everything. "Tomorrow, I'm going to bring someone to talk to you," she said. "Detective Frank Morrison from the state police. He specializes in cases like this, and he's good people. It's going to be hard, Catherine, but you don't have to face this alone anymore." Detective Morrison was a weathered man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much of the world's darkness. He arrived the next morning with a female officer and a tape recorder settling into the hospital room, like he had all the time in the world. "Maria tells me you have a story to tell," he said simply. "I'm here to listen, and I want you to know that nothing you say will shock me or make me think less of you. I've been doing this work for 25 years, and I've learned that the truth, no matter how ugly, is always better than lies." He was patient as I stumbled through the story again, stopping frequently to let me collect myself when the memories became too overwhelming. Unlike the local police who'd dismissed my father's story without question, Detective Morrison asked detailed questions about timeline evidence and potential witnesses. "This journal you mentioned," he said. "Is it still in the cabin?" "It should be," I replied. "Hidden under a loose floorboard in the main room near the fireplace." "And you said there was a hiker who saw you at the window? Can you describe him?" I closed my eyes, trying to remember details from that brief, desperate moment. "Young man, maybe college age. Dark hair, wore a backpack, and carried a walking stick. It was around Christmas time, so he might have been home from school." Detective Morrison nodded, making notes. "We'll canvass the local colleges, see if anyone reported a missing person or unusual sighting in those woods. What about neighbors? Anyone who might have heard screaming or seen your father coming and going at odd hours?" "There's an old woman who lives about half a mile through the woods," I said, remembering the glimpse I'd sometimes caught of smoke from a distant chimney. "Agnes Mueller. She's lived there alone since her husband died, keeps to herself mostly. But the trees are bare in winter. She might have seen something." The investigation that followed was both my salvation and my torture. Returning to the cabin with Detective Morrison and his team meant walking back into the scene of my nightmare, seeing the bed where I'd been raped, the kitchen table where I'd written my desperate letters to a baby who would never read them. But the journal was still there exactly where I'd hidden it, its pages a detailed record of every assault, every threat, every day of captivity. The medical evidence at the hospital supported my claims as well. Dr. Romano had documented injuries consistent with prolonged sexual assault and physical abuse. "This is solid evidence," Detective Morrison told me after the forensics team finished processing the cabin. "But we need witnesses to make the case airtight. Someone who can corroborate your story, place your father at the scene, or contradict his version of events." Finding witnesses proved to be the biggest challenge. The hiker took weeks to track down. A college student named Robert Chen who'd been home for Christmas break when he'd encountered me at the cabin window. He'd been troubled by the incident and had actually asked park rangers about it. But his concerns had been dismissed when my father reported me as mentally unstable and prone to wandering. "I knew something was wrong," Robert testified later. "She looked terrified, desperate. She was mouthing, 'Help me,' and pointing at the door. I should have done more, should have insisted the rangers investigate. I'll regret not pushing harder for the rest of my life." Agnes Mueller was even harder to convince. Detective Morrison and I visited her small cabin multiple times before she finally agreed to talk. She was a tiny bird-like woman in her 70s who'd been widowed for 15 years and had learned to be suspicious of strangers. "I heard screaming," she finally admitted during our fourth visit, her voice so quiet we had to strain to hear her. "Many nights over the winter. Thought it might be animals at first, but animals don't scream like that. Like a woman in pain, in terror. "Why didn't you report it?" Detective Morrison asked gently. Agnes looked at me with eyes full of shame and regret. "Your father came to see me once early in the winter. Said his daughter was staying with him recovering from a nervous breakdown after her husband left. Said she might wander around at night, might make noise, but that I shouldn't worry about it. He was very persuasive, made it clear that interference wouldn't be welcome." She described how my father had subtly threatened her, mentioning how isolated she was, how accidents could happen to elderly people living alone in the woods. Agnes had been too frightened to investigate the screaming, too intimidated by my father's reputation and connections to report what she'd heard. "I should have been braver," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I should have called for help. I'm so sorry, child. I'm so very sorry." My father's arrest sent shockwaves through Millbrook and the surrounding county. The man who'd been seen as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman and devoted father, was now facing charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and child endangerment. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page with the headline, "Respected businessman charged in son-in-law's murder." And suddenly, everyone had an opinion about the case. The town split into two camps, those who believed the evidence and those who couldn't reconcile the charges with the William Harrison they thought they knew. "I can't believe it," Mrs. Henderson told anyone who would listen. "Bill Harrison would never hurt a fly. That girl must be making it up, probably had something to do with her husband's disappearance herself." But others were starting to remember things that had seemed odd at the time, but made terrible sense in light of the charges. The way my father had controlled my social life as a teenager. His strange behavior at my wedding. The speed with which he'd moved me out of my house after Alex's supposed abandonment. "Always thought there was something off about how he looked at that girl," said Tom Bradley, who'd known my father for 20 years. "Too possessive, if you know what I mean. Not the way a normal father acts around his daughter." The trial began in September 1956 and quickly became the biggest story in central Pennsylvania. Reporters came from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh to cover the proceedings, and the courthouse was packed every day with curious onlookers and supporters on both sides. My father's defense attorney, a slick lawyer named Charles Hoffman, who specialized in high-profile criminal cases, immediately went on the attack. He painted me as an unstable young woman who'd suffered a complete mental breakdown after my husband abandoned me, concocting an elaborate fantasy to explain away my own failures and shortcomings. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said in his opening statement, "you're going to hear a story so fantastic, so divorced from reality, that you'll wonder how anyone could believe it. Catherine Harrison is a deeply troubled young woman who couldn't accept that her husband didn't love her enough to stay. Rather than face that painful truth, she's created an elaborate delusion that transforms her loving father into a monster and her own mental illness into a heroic survival story." He brought in psychiatrists who'd never examined me, but were willing to testify about the kinds of delusions that could result from postpartum depression and abandonment trauma. He painted Alex as an irresponsible dreamer who'd probably run off to California or Mexico, leaving his pregnant wife to deal with the consequences of his selfishness. But the prosecution, led by District Attorney Margaret Flynn, had built a methodical case based on physical evidence, witness testimony, and the detailed record I'd kept in my journal. "The defendant wants you to believe that his daughter imagined months of captivity and abuse," DA Flynn told the jury in her opening statement. "But imagination doesn't leave the kind of physical evidence we've collected. Imagination doesn't write detailed journal entries documenting specific dates and incidents. Imagination doesn't leave bloodstains and fingerprints and DNA evidence." The trial lasted 3 weeks, and I testified for 2 full days. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, sitting in that witness box with my father staring at me from the defense table, detailing every assault, every threat, every moment of terror I'd endured. "Tell the jury about the night of October 15th. DA Flynn said gently. "Start from the beginning and take your time." I looked out at the packed courtroom, at the faces of people I'd known my entire life, and began to speak. My husband, Alex, and I were in our kitchen making dinner and talking about baby names. We were happy that night, excited about our future together. Then my father burst through our front door with a knife in his hand. For 2 days, I relived every horrible detail of my captivity. The defense attorney tried to rattle me with aggressive cross-examination, suggesting I was lying that I'd killed Alex myself in a fit of postpartum psychosis, that I'd invented the entire story to cover my own crimes. But I held firm. The truth was my anchor, and no amount of legal maneuvering could shake it. "Yeah, I know what happened to me," I said during one particularly brutal exchange. "I know what my father did to my husband, to me, to our baby. I have the scars, both physical and emotional, to prove it. I have witnesses who heard my screams and saw my desperation. Most importantly, I have the courage to tell the truth, no matter how much it hurts or how hard you try to discredit me." The jury deliberated for 18 hours before returning with their verdict. I sat in the courtroom with Detective Morrison and Maria Santos, my hands shaking as the foreman stood to read the decision. "On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of kidnapping in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of sexual assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." The guilty verdicts continued down the list of charges, each one lifting a weight from my shoulders that I'd been carrying for nearly a year. When the judge sentenced my father to life in prison without the possibility of parole, I felt something inside me break free completely, not just from his physical control, but from the psychological prison he'd built around my mind. Justice had been served, but more importantly, I was finally truly free. After the trial, I made the difficult decision to leave Pennsylvania and start over somewhere completely new. Chicago beckoned, a big city where I could disappear into anonymity, where nobody knew my story or would look at me with pity or morbid curiosity. I found a small apartment on the north side and got a job teaching at a public elementary school where my past remained my own business. The work was challenging but rewarding, giving me a sense of purpose and normalcy that I desperately needed. But healing from trauma isn't a linear process, and I quickly discovered that geographical distance couldn't erase the damage that had been done to my mind and spirit. The nightmares were the worst part. Violent, vivid dreams that left me screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and terror. I'd wake up convinced that my father was in the room, that the cabin walls were closing in around me, that Alex's blood was pooling on my apartment floor. Sometimes the dreams were so realistic that I'd spend hours checking and rechecking the locks on my doors, searching every closet and corner to convince myself I was really safe. Dr. Sarah Klein became my lifeline during those dark months. She was one of the few female psychiatrists in Chicago, a pioneering woman who specialized in treating trauma survivors at a time when most of the medical establishment barely acknowledged that such treatment was necessary. "Why, what you're experiencing is completely normal," she assured me during our first session. "Your mind is trying to process an overwhelming amount of trauma, and these symptoms are actually a sign that you're beginning to heal." Our sessions were intense and often painful. Dr. Klein used techniques that were revolutionary for the time, encouraging me to talk through my experiences in detail rather than simply trying to forget them or move on. "We can't heal what we don't acknowledge," she explained. "The trauma happened, Catherine. It's part of your story now. But it doesn't have to define your entire story. We're going to work together to help you reclaim your power, to understand that survival isn't just about living through something horrible, it's about learning to thrive after it." The process took years. There were setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of despair and flashes of hope. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild not just my life, but my sense of self. "Tell me about who you were before the trauma," Dr. Klein would say during our sessions. "What brought you joy? What were your dreams? What made you feel most like yourself?" Remembering that girl, the one who'd loved teaching, who'd dreamed of travel and adventure, who'd believed in the possibility of happiness, was almost more painful than reliving the trauma. That innocent version of myself felt like a stranger, someone I'd lost forever, along with Alex and our baby. "She's not gone," Dr. Klein insisted. "She's still there inside you, waiting to be rediscovered. The trauma changed you, yes, but it didn't erase the fundamental person you are. Part of healing is learning to integrate all the parts of yourself. The innocent girl, the survivor, the woman you're becoming." 3 years into my healing journey, I made a decision that would transform my recovery from a private process into a public mission. I began volunteering at the Chicago Women's Crisis Center, answering phones on their hotline, and eventually training to become a counselor myself. The work was challenging and often heartbreaking, but it gave my trauma a purpose beyond just surviving it. Every woman I helped, every crisis, I talked someone through every small victory in the battle against domestic violence, felt like a way of honoring not just my own survival, but Alex's memory and our lost baby's brief life. "You have a gift for this work," said Ellen Rodriguez, the center's director, after I'd been volunteering for 6 months. "The women trust you in a way that's remarkable. You have a quality that makes them feel safe, believed, understood." It was true. There was something about having lived through the worst that domestic violence could inflict that gave my words a weight and credibility that textbook training couldn't provide. When I sat across from a bruised woman and said, "I know exactly what you're going through, and I'm here to tell you that you can survive this," they believed me in a way they might not believe someone who'd never walked that path. I started leading support groups, sharing my story in carefully measured doses to help other survivors understand that healing was possible. I testified before the state legislature about the need for better protective services and legal remedies for domestic violence victims. I wrote articles for professional journals about the long-term effects of trauma and the importance of believing survivors when they came forward. The work was demanding and emotionally draining, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Each woman who found the courage to leave an abusive relationship, each survivor who moved from victim to advocate, each small change in law or policy felt like a victory not just for them, but for every person who'd ever suffered in silence. "You're making a real difference," Dr. Klein told me during one of our sessions, "but I want to make sure you're not using this work to avoid dealing with your own healing. There's a difference between processing trauma through service and using service to avoid processing trauma." It was a valid concern. There were times when I threw myself into other people's crises to avoid dealing with my own ongoing struggles. The work gave me a sense of purpose and control that my personal life still lacked, and it was tempting to hide behind the role of helper rather than confronting my own continued vulnerability. "I'm not ready to date yet," I admitted to Dr. Klein during one particularly honest session. "The thought of being intimate with someone, of trusting a man enough to be alone with him, it terrifies me. What if I never get past this? What if the trauma broke something in me that can't be fixed?" "Healing doesn't have a timeline," she reminded me. "And there's no rule that says you have to want romantic relationships to be whole and complete. But I do think it's worth exploring why the idea frightens you so much. What are you really afraid of?" The answer, when I finally found the courage to voice it, was simple and devastating. I was afraid that anyone who truly knew me would see me as damaged goods, that the trauma had marked me in ways that would forever make me unlovable. It was through my work at the crisis center that I met James Wheeler, though it took months before I saw him as anything more than a colleague and friend. He was a social worker specializing in family services, and we often collaborated on cases involving domestic violence and child abuse. James was different from any man I'd ever known. Patient, gentle, unassuming, in a way that put me at ease. He never pushed for more than I was ready to give, never made me feel like my wariness or boundaries were unreasonable or inconvenient. "I've worked with enough trauma survivors to understand that healing happens at its own pace," he told me one evening as we finished up paperwork on a particularly difficult case. "I'm not going anywhere, Catherine. Whether we're friends or colleagues or something more someday, I'm not going anywhere." Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared work and mutual respect rather than passion or romance. We'd have coffee after difficult cases, talking through the challenges of the work and the small victories we'd witnessed. He'd invite me to see movies or visit museums, always casual, always with the understanding that I could change my mind or leave early if I felt uncomfortable. It took me 2 years to accept that what I felt for James was love. Not the passionate, overwhelming emotion I'd shared with Alex, but something steadier and deeper. A love built on understanding compatibility and the kind of trust that could only come from seeing someone at their worst and choosing to stay anyway. I don't know if I can ever be the kind of wife you deserve, I told him the night he proposed, sitting in my apartment with his grandmother's ring between us on the coffee table. The trauma, it changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I have nightmares, panic attacks, days when I can barely function. I may never be able to have children. Are you really sure this is what you want? James took my hands in his, looking directly into my eyes with the kind of steady certainty that had drawn me to him from the beginning. Catherine, I'm not asking you to be anyone other than who you are right now in this moment. I've seen you at your strongest and your most vulnerable, and I love all of it. I love your courage, your compassion, your determination to turn your pain into purpose. I love the way you fight for other people and the way you're learning to fight for yourself. If children are in our future, wonderful. If not, we'll build our family in other ways. What matters to me is building a life with you, whatever that looks like. We married in the summer of 1960 in a small ceremony at the Crisis Center, surrounded by survivors' advocates and colleagues who'd become our chosen family. It wasn't the fairy tale wedding I'd once dreamed of, but it was perfect in its own way. A celebration of love found after loss of hope, rebuilt from the ashes of trauma. For the first 5 years of our marriage, James and I assumed that children weren't in our future. The doctors couldn't find any physical reason why I wasn't getting pregnant, but they suggested that the trauma I'd endured might have created psychological barriers to conception. Sometimes the mind protects the body in ways we don't fully understand, Dr. Romano, my gynecologist, explained during one of my routine checkups. Your body went through tremendous trauma during your pregnancy and loss. It's possible that some part of your subconscious is preventing another pregnancy as a protective mechanism. I'd made my peace with childlessness, finding fulfillment in my work with survivors, and in helping to raise the children of friends and colleagues. James and I talked about adoption occasionally, but the process seemed daunting, and we were both fulfilled by our careers and advocacy work. Then in 1965, everything changed in the most unexpected way. Lisa Martinez was 17 years old when she came to the crisis center 6 months pregnant and covered in bruises from her boyfriend's latest beating. She was terrified, alone, and convinced that she had no options other than staying with her abuser or ending up on the streets. "I can't keep this baby," she told me during our first session, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "I can barely take care of myself, and if Miguel finds out I'm thinking about leaving him, he'll kill me. He's threatened to before." I worked with Lisa for months, helping her develop a safety plan and connecting her with resources for single mothers. But as her due date approached, she made a decision that surprised us both. "I want you to raise my baby," she told me one afternoon as we sat in my office. "I've been watching you, listening to how you talk about children, seeing how you are with the kids who come through here. You'd be a good mother, Mrs. Wheeler, better than I could ever be." The request was both heartbreaking and extraordinary. Lisa was planning to move to California after the birth, starting over with a new identity and distance from her abuser. She wanted her child to have the kind of stable, loving home she couldn't provide. "Are you sure about this?" I asked her. "This isn't a decision you can unmake, Lisa. Once the adoption is final, once you sign those papers..." "I'm sure," she said firmly. "This baby deserves better than a mother who's running from violence, better than growing up in fear. You and Mr. Wheeler, you know what love looks like. You know how to keep people safe. That's what I want for my child." The legal process was complex and emotionally charged. James and I had to undergo background checks, home studies, and interviews with social workers. We had to prove our financial stability, our emotional readiness, and our commitment to raising a child who would always know they were chosen and wanted. Michael James Wheeler was born on a snowy February morning in 1966, and I fell in love with him the moment the nurse placed him in my arms. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair, and eyes that seemed to look right through me to some essential truth about love and family. "Well, he's beautiful," Lisa whispered from her hospital bed, tears streaming down her face as she watched me hold her son. "Take good care of him. Tell him his birth mother loved him enough to give him the best life she could." Raising Michael was a revelation. All the fear and anxiety I'd carried about my ability to be a mother, all the worry that my trauma had broken something essential in me, melted away in the face of his complete dependence and trust. He didn't care about my past or my scars. He only cared that I was there when he needed me, that I loved him unconditionally, that I made him feel safe in the world. "You're a natural at this," James observed one evening, as I rocked Michael to sleep singing the same lullabies Alex had once hummed to my belly. "Look at how calm he is with you, how much he trusts you." It was true. Despite all my fears about being damaged by trauma, motherhood came naturally to me. I found joy in the small moments, first smiles, first words, the way Michael would reach for me when he was tired or scared. I discovered a fierce protectiveness that surprised me with its intensity, a mama bear instinct that would do anything to keep my child safe. 2 years later, we added to our family again when Hope entered our lives. She was 8 years old when social services removed her from her mother's home after years of neglect and abuse. Her mother was a crack addict who'd been in and out of treatment programs, and Hope had essentially been raising herself and her younger siblings for years. "She's going to need a lot of patience and understanding," warned Jenny Patterson, the social worker who brought Hope to us for her first visit. "She's been through significant trauma, and she has major trust issues. She's been let down by every adult in her life up to this point." Hope was tiny for her age, with enormous brown eyes that held too much knowledge about the world's cruelties. She barely spoke during those first weeks, watching us warily from corners, and flinching whenever we moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. "I know what that look means," I told James one night after Hope had finally fallen asleep. "I recognize the hypervigilance the way she's always scanning for danger. She's living in survival mode." Drawing on my experience with trauma survivors, I approached Hope's healing with the same patience and consistency I'd learned in my own recovery. I never forced interaction, never pushed her to share more than she was ready to reveal. Instead, I simply showed up day after day, proving through actions rather than words that she was safe with us. The breakthrough came 3 months after she moved in during a thunderstorm that sent her into a panic attack. I found her huddled in her closet, hyperventilating and calling for her mother despite everything that woman had put her through. "It's okay, sweetheart," I said softly, sitting outside the closet door. "You're safe. The storm can't hurt you here. I'm going to stay right here until it passes, okay? You don't have to come out if you don't want to, but you're not alone." We sat there for 2 hours, me talking quietly about everything and nothing, while Hope gradually calmed down. When she finally emerged from the closet, she crawled into my lap like the little girl she still was, beneath all that premature toughness. "I was so scared," she whispered against my shoulder. "In the old place, when it stormed, the roof leaked, and sometimes men would come over and hurt Mama, and I had to keep the babies quiet so they wouldn't get mad at us too. That must have been terrifying," I said, stroking her hair. "But that's not going to happen here, Hope. James and I are going to keep you safe. We're not going anywhere, and we're not going to let anyone hurt you." It was the first of many conversations we'd have about her past, each one building trust and connection between us. Hope was officially adopted into our family 6 months later, and watching her transform from a wary, traumatized child into a confident, loving daughter was one of the greatest privileges of my life. By 1970, James and I had settled into a comfortable rhythm of work, family, and advocacy. Michael was 4, and Hope was 10, both thriving in school and activities. I'd published several articles about trauma recovery and had been invited to speak at conferences around the country about domestic violence prevention. My father had died in prison the year before, a heart attack that felt like the final closing of a door I'd walked through long ago. I felt no satisfaction in his death, but there was a sense of relief that the last tie to that chapter of my life had been severed. It was during this period of stability and growth that Dr. Klein and I began to notice subtle changes in my physical and emotional health that would prove significant later. "You seem different lately," she observed during one of our monthly sessions. "More relaxed, less hypervigilant. Your sleep patterns have improved dramatically, and you mentioned that the nightmares have become much less frequent." It was true. The constant state of alertness I'd lived with for 15 years was finally beginning to ease. I could walk into a room without automatically noting all the exits. I could be touched unexpectedly without jumping out of my skin. The hypervigilance that had been necessary for survival was slowly being replaced by a sense of genuine safety and trust. "I think it's the combination of factors," I told her. "The therapy, obviously, but also the family stability, the meaningful work, the sense that I've rebuilt my life into something good and purposeful. For the first time since the trauma, I feel like I'm truly living rather than just surviving." What I didn't realize at the time was that this psychological healing was having profound effects on my physical health as well. Dr. Romano had been monitoring my reproductive health for years, documenting the ways that chronic stress and trauma had affected my hormonal cycles and overall fertility. "Chronic trauma keeps the body in a constant state of fight or flight," she explained during one of my checkups. "The stress hormones that get released during this state can suppress reproductive function as a protective mechanism. As you heal emotionally, as your nervous system learns to relax and trust again, your body's natural functions can begin to restore themselves." The changes were gradual but measurable. My menstrual cycles became more regular. My hormone levels stabilized. The chronic tension I'd carried in my muscles and joints began to ease. It was as if my body was finally exhaling after holding its breath for 15 years. I was 41 years old when I woke up one morning in the spring of 1971, feeling nauseated and dizzy in a way that was hauntingly familiar. My first thought was that I must be coming down with the flu that was going around the kids' schools, but something about the sensation nagged at me throughout the day. "Mom, are you okay?" Hope asked that evening as I pushed food around on my plate without eating. "You look kind of green." "Just tired, sweetheart." I assured her, though privately, I was beginning to wonder if something more significant might be happening. It was James who finally suggested the possibility I'd been afraid to voice. "Catherine," he said gently as we got ready for bed that night, "when was your last period?" The question sent a jolt of recognition through me. I'd been so busy with work and family that I hadn't been paying close attention to my cycle, but now that he mentioned it, "It's been a while," I admitted. "But you know how irregular I've always been. The doctor said the trauma could have permanent effects." "Maybe," he said carefully. "But maybe we should rule out other possibilities." The pregnancy test seemed like a formality, a way to eliminate the impossible before looking for more realistic explanations for my symptoms. I'd taken similar tests over the years during false alarms, always with negative results and the familiar pang of disappointment I tried to hide from James. But this time was different. This time, the little pink line appeared clear and unmistakable, and I stared at it in shock for long minutes before calling James into the bathroom. "Is that—" he began, then stopped staring at the test with the same disbelief I felt. "I think so," I whispered. "I think I'm pregnant." The confirmation from Dr. Romano a week later felt surreal. After 16 years of believing that pregnancy was impossible for me, after making peace with childlessness and building our family through adoption, I was carrying a child. "I have to be honest," Dr. Romano said as she reviewed my test results. "This is medically remarkable. Given your history, your age, the length of time you've been trying, this is what we'd have to call a miracle of healing." She went on to explain her theory about the connection between psychological recovery and physical restoration. The way that trauma recovery could literally rewire the nervous system and restore functions that had been suppressed for survival. Your body has been healing along with your mind, she said. The stress reduction, the stable family environment, the sense of safety and purpose you've built, all of these factors have contributed to a level of healing that's allowed your reproductive system to function normally again. It wasn't magic or divine intervention, though it felt miraculous. It was the result of years of hard work, therapy, love, and the kind of comprehensive healing that addresses trauma at every level: emotional, psychological, and physical. The pregnancy at 41 came with increased risks and careful monitoring, but it progressed normally. Michael, now 5, was thrilled about becoming a big brother, and Hope at 11 took her role as protective big sister very seriously. Are you sure the baby's going to be okay?" Hope asked me one evening as we sat together, her hand resting on my growing belly. "You're kind of old to be having a baby, Mom." I laughed, marveling at her directness. "The doctors are keeping a close eye on us, sweetheart. And yes, I'm older than most first-time moms, but I'm healthy and strong. This baby is going to be just fine." What I didn't tell her was how emotionally complex the pregnancy was for me. Every milestone, the first heartbeat, the first ultrasound, the first movements, brought back memories of my first pregnancy and the baby I'd lost in those woods 16 years earlier. "It's normal to feel conflicted," Dr. Klein assured me during one of our sessions. "This pregnancy is healing, but it's also a reminder of loss. You're allowed to feel joy and grief at the same time." James was wonderfully supportive throughout the pregnancy, taking on extra household responsibilities and being patient with my occasional emotional outbursts and anxiety attacks. He understood better than anyone what this pregnancy meant to me and to our family. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," I admitted to him one night in my 7th month. "I keep expecting to lose this baby too, and I don't know if I could survive that again." "This isn't then, Catherine," he reminded me gently. "You're not that frightened girl trapped in a cabin. You're not alone, you're not in danger, and you have an entire support system surrounding you and this baby. This time is different." David Alexander Wheeler was born on a crisp October morning in 1971. 16 years to the day after Alex's murder. The timing felt significant, as if the universe was offering me a chance to transform that date from one of loss into one of overwhelming joy. Holding my son for the first time, looking into eyes that reminded me of both Alex and my lost baby, I felt a completion I hadn't even realized I was missing. This child represented everything my father had tried to destroy: love, hope, family, the future itself. "Welcome to the world, little miracle," I whispered against his tiny head as James and the older children crowded around the hospital bed. "You're proof that healing is possible, that love is stronger than hate, that sometimes the most beautiful gifts come after the darkest storms." Now, as I write this final chapter at the age of 75, David is 44 years old with children of his own. Hope became a social worker like James, dedicating her life to helping families in crisis. Michael followed in my footsteps and became a therapist specializing in trauma recovery. Our family tree is full of healing professions, as if we've all been called to transform pain into purpose. The crisis center where I volunteered for 30 years has grown into a comprehensive resource center with multiple locations throughout Chicago. I served on its board of directors for 15 years and helped establish protocols that are now used in crisis centers across the country. My book, After the Storm: A Survivor's Journey to Healing, became a bestseller and is still used as a resource for survivors and the professionals who work with them. I've spoken at hundreds of conferences and universities, sharing my story and advocating for better understanding of trauma and recovery. But my greatest pride isn't in the professional accomplishments or public recognition. It's in the family we built from the ashes of tragedy, in the children who grew up knowing they were chosen and cherished, in the grandchildren who will never know a world where they aren't completely safe and loved. "How did you do it, Grandma Catherine?" my oldest granddaughter asked me recently. "How did you survive something so terrible and still build such a beautiful life?" It's a question I get often, and the answer is both simple and complex. I survived because I had help from people like Maria Santos, who recognized my pain and believed my story, from Dr. Klein, who guided me through the long process of healing, from James, who loved me not despite my scars, but including them as part of who I am. I survived because I found purpose in my pain, transforming my trauma into a tool for helping others. I survived because I learned that healing isn't about forgetting or moving on. It's about integrating all parts of your story into a life that honors both the darkness and the light. Most importantly, I survived because I held on to hope, even when it seemed impossible, even when the darkness felt endless, even when everyone around me said it was time to give up. The pregnancy at 41 wasn't really a miracle in the supernatural sense. It was the result of comprehensive healing, the kind that happens when trauma is addressed not just emotionally, but physically, when safety is established not just externally, but internally, when love is offered not just romantically, but in all its forms. Dr. Romano was right when she said my body had healed along with my mind. Years of therapy, stable relationships, meaningful work, and the kind of deep safety that only comes with time had allowed my nervous system to finally relax, my hormones to regulate, my reproductive system to function as it was designed to. David's birth was the culmination of that healing journey, proof that even the most damaged parts of ourselves can be restored when we commit to the hard work of recovery and surround ourselves with people who believe in our capacity for wholeness. If you're reading this and you're in the middle of your own dark storm, please know that your story isn't over yet. The miracle you're looking for might not look like you expect it to. It might not be dramatic or immediate or obvious, but healing is possible even from the worst trauma, even when it feels impossible, even when everyone tells you it's time to accept that some things can't be fixed. The scars will always be there, thin white lines that map the geography of survival. But scars are proof that we healed, evidence that we were strong enough to knit ourselves back together when everything fell apart. Some stories end with revenge, others end with justice. But the best stories, the ones worth living and telling, end with love, triumphant hope restored, and the unshakable knowledge that every survivor is proof of the human spirit's incredible resilience. My father was wrong about everything. I didn't belong to him. I never did. I belonged to myself, to the family I chose, and created to the life I built from the ashes of the old one. This is my story. This is my truth. This is my miracle. Not a supernatural intervention, but the natural result of refusing to let trauma have the final word, of believing in the possibility of healing, even when it seemed impossible, of surrounding myself with people who saw my worth, even when I couldn't see it myself. And if I could do it, if a broken, traumatized 25-year-old could survive the worst that life had to offer and build something beautiful from the ruins, then you can too. The miracle isn't that good things happen to good people. The miracle is that human beings have the capacity to heal, to grow, to transform even the worst experiences into wisdom and strength and compassion for others who are still fighting their way out of the darkness. Your healing is possible. Your story matters. Your life has value beyond measure. Keep fighting, keep believing, keep moving toward the light. The miracle is already beginning, even if you can't see it yet.